Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the first colloquium of this academic year. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Carla Youngdahl. Today, Dr. Youngdahl is an assistant professor at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And her area, as you are going to hear, is in investigating how auditory attention develops and how children use auditory attention to actually process speech in noise. She earned her PhD degree in speech and hearing science from The Ohio State University, and she did a lot of studies there on several NIH-funded projects. And before that, she was a speech-language pathologist in a variety of clinical settings for 10 years. So she has a wide range of clinical experience. But most importantly, she's a graduate of Ohio University. I don't know if you can actually see this very clearly, but back in 2005, when we only had 15 SLP students, she was one of the chosen ones, right? So just in case you can't see her very well, she has not changed much, right? So, so we're really, really glad to have an alumnum visiting us today. Before I finish this introduction, I'd like to share actually two short stories about Carla. So Carla was actually in the very first experimental phonetics class that I taught since I came to OU. So some of you might know that I have this habit of posting tidbits of information about science and everything at my door. So over the years, Carla was pretty much the only person that paid attention to that, because I know that because she came up to me and asked to do some research with me. So we actually did some research together. So I think I really appreciate this intellectual curiosity about basic science. And the second story actually has to do with the experimental phonetics class. So one day, we were doing a lab on voice onset time. So many of you probably know what that is. If not, you should. So it was a late night class, I believe, and people were getting tired. And acoustics is really not the best topic to discuss at that time. So there was a student in the class, her cohort, getting frustrated about certain procedures. So she didn't know what to do, and she just said something to me about, why do we need to do this? How is this relevant? And I got upset as a young assistant professor, and I was upset because, how can you challenge, the value of basic science? So at that moment of tension, Carla actually stood up and moved to the student's desk and started helping her with whatever task at hand. And at that point, I think all the frustration and upsets just went away magically. So I think I will remember this forever. So I'm really glad that the combination of interpersonal skills and also intellectual curiosity made who Carla is today. And I'm very glad to introduce Carla to all of you. Thank you.
First things first, get my picture down. You'll see me enough. So thanks. So I was here for my master's in speech. I had a plan. When I was an undergrad, I declared as a communication science and disorders major at a different college. And I had a plan I knew I kind of liked research, but where I was for undergrad didn't have a lot of opportunities for that. I came to OU, and I still knew I kind of liked research, but I wanted to be a speech therapist. I wanted to play games with kids all day, and things like that. And Dr. Lee's class actually really helped me see, this is what I like. And maybe I can do both. And I can have that clinical side to me and still have where I investigate things and look at what is considered basic science and things that some people question, maybe how is this relevant to me as a clinician, and show how that kind of can bridge the gap between the two. And so a lot of my work has been trying to bridge that gap. And it's also bridging the gap between what speech-language pathologists do and audiologists. So I kind of like, yes, I will just be this connector pulled different ways to talk about what's basic science and how does that help us clinically, and how does that also apply to both audiologists and speech-language pathologists. So, title, Development of Spectral Listening Strategies for Speech and Noise. What we know about speech is that it's very robust. There are lots of cues that we use to understand speech. We are human, we love speech. That's what pulls us apart from other animals. We have the acoustic cues that are across temporal aspects, across time, across spectral aspects, across frequency. But then there's also linguistic cues and how we use our language to fill in the blanks if we miss something. Because speech is so robust, has so many different cues, as adults, we're all really good to hear speech even when it's noisy. So if you think about how you hear speech all the time, it is very seldom in a very quiet room with nothing else going on. Even here, there's fans going on overhead. Usually there is noise in your environment, even if it's shuffling papers or cell phones. There's noise, but yet we can still understand speech in very noisy environments as adults. What research has found is that kids struggle with this a lot more. And it's important to think about that because we pile kids in classrooms full of their noisy little peers. And sometimes 22 in a classroom or up to 30 in a classroom. And with what we know with our basic scientific research is kids have trouble hearing in noise more than adults. Yet we put these kids in a noisy environment and expect them to learn the most important stuff of their life and go through the educational process with that noise going on. So part of my work has been trying to pull apart, okay, what part of noise is it that is hard for them? Because I say, oh well, we already know they struggle in noise more. So my work has been focusing on what are some of the specific things we can look at. So the first one thing I'm going to talk about is remote maskers. So if we talk about a remote masker, noise is a mask over speech. So visually, if you have a mask on, it covers your face. Auditorily, if you have a mask, it's something that is covering up that noise. So like ksh over top of speech is going to mask it and cover it up. If it's a remote masker, it's spectrally far away from where your speech is. So past work has shown, this is for tone detection. So comparing how well adults can detect a tone, just a little beep, in noise. And this is a typical audiology test, is finding masked thresholds. So what we're looking here, we have adults, we have some 7 to 9-year-olds and 4 to 6-year-olds. And up here, it's the amount of masking. So this is saying how were their mask thresholds different from when it was just quiet detecting the beep, when we added a noise. For adults, they do about the same. So 0 means no change. They could hear that beep, beep, in quiet, and hear it just the same as if you put a remote masker. So something like something really high frequency, spectrally remote, far away from it spectrally. But they could still detect that beep just fine because there was no spectral overlap. It was far, far away. When we got to 7 to 9-year-olds, this is labeled enough, they found that they performed like adults. There was 0 difference. Their mask thresholds were similar to in quiet. But then when they got to 4 to 6-year-olds, skyrocketed. So if it was the same in quiet and masked, it'd be right here, like our adults and 7 to 9-year-olds. But instead, they needed it to be 3.5 decibels louder to hear it. So something's going on. Just to detect a tone was harder when it's noisy. So I'm interested, well, how does that apply to speech? So I developed this where, okay, let's have speech and have it just down here. And have remote maskers up here and see how well they could understand speech. Speech is robust. There's lots of acoustic cues. Can they tune into that and still understand the speech message? So you can hear what this sounds like, because that's the more fun part. Pull up. So they had to listen to a sentence. and had to tell me what they heard. So they would have,
Ready? The cow gave some milk.
easy to understand. We made it harder. There we go, I'm sorry. So now we're looking at another sentence, but now if you looked at that first one, it was clean, just how we would want to hear it. When you look at the spectrogram, look, the speech is taking up all of these frequencies, all those frequency ranges. But we wanted to make sure that our noise doesn't overlap at all. So that way we had to cut off the speech a little bit because we didn't want any overlap. So if we cut it off, okay, now you see I've chopped it off. We don't have any of these higher frequencies in the speech because that's where I'm going to put my noise and have it far away from the speech so it shouldn't overlap and shouldn't affect them. So here's what that sounds like.
Ready? They are pushing an old car.
Okay, what does that sound like to you? Talking like this, a little bit muffled, maybe like a really bad drive-through menu. We can still understand that pretty well. Hear it again. See if, do you know what he's saying?
Ready? They are pushing an old car.
What is he saying? Pushing an old car. Easy. There was lots of cues for you to understand what he's saying. Kids could understand that pretty well too. So we do have to make this harder because then they would get it right every single time for our baseline, and we need more wiggle room to see what's actually affecting them. So to make it a little bit harder, we do, like it's shown in the schematic here, I had this speech-shaped noise. So it's speech-shaped because it's only covering up exactly where the speech was. It's only occurring in those same frequency region. And I think you'll still be able to catch what this is. This will be a little bit harder because now we see on the spectrogram, all right, yeah, I chopped off the speech and now I have some noise on top of it. So we can kind of see some darker sections where there's some speech peeking through on our spectrogram. When we look at the waveform, you can see, oh yeah, there's some speech and there's some speech, but then there's just this noise going on. See if you can understand this one. Anyone think they know it? All right, listen to it again. It's tough.
Cat jumped off the fence.
Yes, the cat jumped off the fence. Okay, ooh, she's on. So it's difficult, but it's doable. Difficult, but doable. So you could get most of those words right. And adults, we're good. We can do that. And this is like the noise that we can deal with, and we can still understand speech. But then more. Okay, so now you've listened to the speech all by itself. You listen to the speech with that noise on top. Here's where we're interested in. What if I add a noise way up here? And you, as adults, you should be fine. You'll perform the same as if it was just that noise there. One thing about when you make speech in this, or when you make a noise that's very remote, we had to make it really high-pitched, and that's kind of annoying. I can kind of show you how we divided it up. We tried some different noises, because one thing we thought is, well, if kids are having trouble because maybe noise that's kind of close, even though it's not overlapping, is getting in the way, let's look at some different. So we have like a little turquoise one you might be able to see. Let's look at a wide chunk that's kind of close, and then some narrower ones that get further and further away to see if there's going to be any differences if we get further and further away from where the speech is. So each one of those little bumps here was a different kind of our remote noises. If we go back, here's the really horrible part. When you hear what these noises sound like, so just so you're prepared, the first one is going to sound like the worst cicada outbreak. One of those 7-year events. If you're auditorily sensitive, you might want to cover. So here's what it sounds like. So if that's over top of speech, which the speech was down low, and this is up high, as an adult you should be fine. But then we looked at, okay, what about some smaller chunks? So you can kind of compare. That was a big wide band of noise over there. Here we got a smaller band of noise. So if we listen to that, so this gets worse. So this gets more like a really annoying whistle. But then, okay, what if we get even more remote? So if you notice as we go, it bumps up from being noise down here to we're going to get even higher frequency. So it's going to get higher pitch. And we're not done yet. It gets higher. Okay, so now we have it. We're even cut it off a little bit because it was so high. Even higher. This is like a tea kettle whistle. And even higher than it wasn't even there. And as annoying as obnoxious as those are, the speech is spectrally in a different location. So they shouldn't impact how well you understand speech at all. So if you look at I have some colorful spectrograms there, you can kind of see. So we wanted to know, all right, adults, we think we know how you will do. That you will do well with speech with just a noise right on top of it, and then we can throw any of those really high-pitched annoying noises in there, and you'll do just the same. And then we looked at some kind of older children, 9-year-olds. Or 7-year-olds, not even 9-year-olds, 7-year-olds. So by older children, that's not much older. And then younger children, 5-year-olds. So looking at just a small range between 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds. Because in those studies looking at just tone detection, they were seeing a difference between 5 and 9. So maybe we can narrow it down to even a difference here. So let's see if you as the adults can perform like we think you will. Fine, we're there, we're here. I need to zoom out. Okay, you caught some of it in there. Here it is. So there's that noise that was hard. We have a remote noise on top. Anybody think they caught any words? At first you thought that's impossible. But then when you listen, you're really good at extracting out where that speech is. Listen to it one more time and maybe you'll fill in more blanks. The girl caught the cold. Or caught a cold. It might be a cold. So it's hard, but you could do it. So that's like kudos to you. That's difficult, but you're still doing it. We could listen to another one too, because these are fun. See if you can catch any of these. Let me get it all the way so we don't cut it off. Someone up here got it first time. All right, one more time. Was it a he or a she? She. And she was doing, and she brushed her hair. See if you can pick it out now. So now you're like, oh yeah, there it is. It's hard, but you're doing it. Even the first semester, we had someone who's really good. She separated out and heard the whole sentence. And we think that the adults, they can do this. And we know they should be able to do this. But what we don't know is how are the kids going to do with this. So that's what we looked at. So here's how the adults did. So what we have is the different remote maskers, where it was a 1 octave, kind of fat, thick band, and then some narrower. They were a 3rd octave wide, and we started up with our lower cutoff being kind of low, around 3,000 hertz, and then we shifted it up so its lower cutoff was 4,000 hertz to 5,000 and 6,000 hertz. And we just measured percent correct. How much did they get right? Up here, this dashed line, that's how they did when we just had the speech with that little ksh, where you guys, it was pretty easy for you now, especially compared to those other noises. Our adults, with just speech and speech-shaped noise, they were getting about 75% of the words. 75% of the message. That's a lot. That's missing some, but that's good. When we added in those annoying high noises, performance stayed high. Stayed right where they were at the beginning. There's only like, when we look at this, when we, what we didn't see was there was no real significant difference, even though this kind of dips down. It wasn't a significant dip in performance when we got to that really high annoying one. It's only a 1% difference when we average these on how they did when there was a remote masker versus just the speech and noise. That's good. That's what we expect. So then we look at our older kids, our 7-year-olds. So when they had speech and noise, their baseline, their performance was about, let's see, about 67%. When we added in those remote high annoying noises, performance stayed about the same. One thing you might notice, for people who know what SNR is, signal to noise ratio, for adults, we mix the speech and the speech-shaped noise, the ones that take up that same frequency space, at 0 dB SNR, meaning they were the same loudness level. For kids, we couldn't do that. When it was 0, their performance was way down here, really low. They hit the floor faster because noise is impacting them. So even though this is trying to parse apart what parts of noise are impacting them, it's still not telling us the whole picture. So we put it where it's positive 5 dB SNR mix for kids, so that the speech was 5 decibels louder than that noise taking up the same frequency space. What this did is it got their baseline performance similar to adults, so we could compare them to adults more directly when we added those high frequency noises. And our 7-year-olds did good. When they added those high frequency noises, they're within 2 percentage points of their performance in that baseline. Now for our 5-year-olds though, so our younger kids, it doesn't look like much, but it is. So our younger kids, when it was just the speech and the speech-shaped noise taking up that same frequency space, their baseline was about 62% correct. When we added any of the remote maskers, performance dropped. And it averaged to be like an 8 percentage point drop in performance, which, I mean, adults are performing like within 1% on average with any of those remote maskers, and then it's 8% drop. And that's losing a lot of message then when you get to that point. So if their baseline was 62% and there may be about 8% points, you're losing another 8% of the message with that extra noise, while adults were losing maybe 1%, if that.
But I'm sorry, if you add the adult, the plus 5 dB SNR, what happens then?
If we
If you have the same situation like adult, signal to noise ratio.
have the adults have positive 5,
Yeah.
they're 100% all the time. For adults, if we have the speech 5 dB louder than the noise, we're 100%. That's enough for us that we get it every single time. And so then if we are adding or subtracting and looking at the details, we're already at the ceiling. We don't see a lot of change then, and we can't say that anything was making a difference. So what we got okay, adults and those older children were not affected by remote maskers. The younger children were. And that kind of went with what they saw with just detecting tones and those mask thresholds. And so, research-wise and clinically, what we know about children are there's so much individual variability. When we work with adults, we can be like, okay, fully developed system, you're an adult, we can lump you all together, perfect. Kids, both just as you work with clients, you know that they're an individual, you need to customize the therapy to them. In research also, when you work with kids, the hard part is there's so much individual variability. So we thought, well, let's look at these individual kids. And let's look at them by their age. So down here we have age. So from the youngest kids, we had some that had just turned 5, all the way to our oldest kids, we had one that was about to turn 8. And we had the gap in the middle because we had no 6-year-olds, just 5 and 7. And we looked at their difference in performance between how they did in the control, which was just the speech, and the noise that was right in that same frequency space as the speech. And that was that dashed line, compared to how they did when there were remote maskers present. So with our younger kids, we see, and then this is where adults were. Adults had, that about 1% difference in performance. So they have this dashed line. Our younger kids, we had some that it was as much as a 20% difference when there was a remote masker present. We had some that were rock stars, though. But as you see, there was a strong correlation that with age, they get to this more adult-like performance. But it's important to also just look at these individuals. We had a 5-year-old, 5.5-year-old performing the same as a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old. So we're individuals, and that developmental time frame is happening a little bit differently for individual children. So now, one of my other questions, so we looked at speech when there's really annoying remote noise. But what about what's called spectrally interleaved noise? So what we know about this is if we have peripheral auditory filters, and they help us process frequency regions when we understand speech. So like if the black bands are speech and the gray is noise, and we can line them up with roughly how the peripheral auditory filters are processing frequencies, we can then create a signal that mimics where I'm filling this filter with speech only, and I'm filling the filter next to it with noise only, and the filter next to it with speech only. When research has done that, they've found that, what if we only give you 15 of those bands that are kind of like your peripheral filters of speech, and then we have the different noise, that we can have it right next to it, in between. We could have it where it's noise all across, and I'll show you more pictures to explain this. Or what if I have that backwards. Let me show you the picture. So, if we break up our speech into these bands, so this is looking at frequency, and we divide it up. And so it looks like a little picket fence. And they line up to approximately what your inner ear is doing with the peripheral filters. So we have 15 bands of speech. Sometimes we're going to put speech in between. So it'd be like this. If this is our speech, we'll put it in between like this. So it's off frequency. Sometimes we're going to put the speech on the exact same spot, so on frequency, where it's the speech and the noise are in the same filters. Sometimes we're going to put noise everywhere, in between and on top of, and that's going to be called broadband. So with adults, trying to understand consonants like ah, pa, ah, ka, ah, ga, when there was 15 bands of speech, this, and then they put noise everywhere, both between and on top of, performance was about 60% correct. When they had it where the noise was only on top of, so they took away the in-between speech, just noise on top of where the speech was, on frequency, performance was about the same, around 60%. When we shift it to be in between where the speech is, that off frequency, spectrally interleaved, so it's just right next to it, but it's not on top of it, performance jumps up to 80%, being very close to how they do if there was just 15 bands and no noise at all. So that's what we know about how adults do with a speech recognition task. It's just consonants, but that's still speech. It's not just tones. What this is showing is that, well, whether it's everywhere or just on the same frequency space, it's impacting it the same. So those on-frequency noises are what really is doing the masking in that situation. So this is how we have it then. We have the 15 bands of speech just by themselves, all in quiet. We have where it's interleaved, where we have the 15 bands of speech, and then noise in between, off frequency, interleaved. Or we have 15 bands of speech with it on frequency, that same space, or broadband, it's all of them, filled with noise. Here's what that sounds like. So if we look it up here. So for this experiment, we did words instead of sentences. So here's just what kind of typically what they sounded like.
Say the word day.
Say the word day. Nice, clear speech. For some audiology students, it might sound familiar. Here we can see, you kind of see these stripes. You see the stripes in the spectrogram because that's showing that we've taken out 15 of the bands. And so you see these little spectral stripes of no energy. Because this is showing 15 bands of speech where we took out the in-between. And it sounds like this.
Say the word ran.
All right, could you understand that word? Is it say the word ran? So, I mean, it sounds a little weird.
Say the word ran.
But you can understand it just fine. Okay, so now, though, we get harder. Now we have, let me zoom in more. Let's see if we can see it more. Let me pull up. Try to see where you can see this the best. Here's a colorful spectrogram. Here's a more colorful spectrogram that you can kind of see the bands going across. So when the speech is happening and you see some bands of speech, and now we have, there's off-frequency noise. So in 15 other bands, there's this noise going all the way across. And then you can still see the speech then in those other 15 bands that just show speech. And that's what you just heard when he said, say the word ran. You heard something like that. We also have, what if it's spectrally overlapping? Oh wait, hold on, I didn't play you the off-frequency noise. 9, 8. That's in quiet. Here is off. Okay, so the noise itself just sounds like this. So just 15 bands of noise. Sounds just like noise.
Say the word high.
Could you catch that one? I'll play it again.
Say the word high.
Say the word high. Let's try it. Here's another one.
Say the word twins.
Twins. That was a little easier because then that got masked more easily. So it's pretty easy when it's interleaved. So your speech is here in these bands and your noise was in between it. And you could process those filters pretty independently to understand the speech signal. If we change it that it's completely overlapping though, it's going to get harder. So the noise is going to sound about the same. It's shifted because now it's the on-frequency filters in those frequency regions.
Say the word C.
C? Mm-hmm. So still not too bad.
Say the word
Say the word.
Say the word
The. I know. That's why this wasn't part of the study because we felt like it wasn't a good enough word to put in there. But it was doable. And then our last one, then what if we have noise across all of that broad band? Noise across all, let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so now our spectrogram, we don't see any stripes anywhere. Because every single filter, whether it had speech or not, has noise in it. So we have 15 bands that have speech and noise, and then 15 bands with just the noise. Well, I'll give you more time on that one. Here's just what the noise sounds like. So it's white noise. Pink or think. Think kids think. So it got a lot harder. Up. So even though that noise is there, you're still doing pretty good. So let's see. So we look at. So again, we looked at adults because you're our comparison. We looked at our older children. This time we had a 6-year-old. So age ranges was from 6 years, 7 months to 7 years, 11 months. Most of them were 7, around 7, a little over 7.5. And our younger children being just 5-year-olds. Okay, so here's how adults did. So this is the percent correct, so how many words they got right in that condition, and what kind of condition it was. Up here at the top is how they did when it was just 15 bands of speech, no noise at all, just completely quiet. They did great, nearly 100%. I think it was like 98% correct. When we had all the noise, so noise in between and on top of that broadband was everywhere, performance was only like 27%. It was difficult. When we had on-frequency noise, where it was just where the speech was, just in those bands the speech was, overlapping completely, performance was about 38%. And our statistics showed that those were not significantly different. When it was off frequency, so now the noise is just shifted to be only where the speech is not, performance went up to 60%, which was shown to be statistically different. That's similar to how they did with the consonants. When they were listening to consonants, broadband and on were similar. Off frequency was more like quiet. For this, they didn't quite get up to quiet performance for words. We're still working out why that is. Why were they so similar with consonant recognition, and why is that so different with words? Still working on that one. When we look at our older children, they showed a similar pattern. When there was noise, broadband noise, so noise not only where the speech was, but also in between everywhere, their performance was about 38%. You're like, oh, that's better than the adults did. But we had to change it. We had to change that ratio to get their performance more similar to adults. Because when we look at how did they do with just 15 bands, no noise at all, their performance was good, but it was like 96%, not near 100 like the adults were. So in broadband, noise everywhere, their performance was like 38%. When we took away and it was only noise exactly where the speech was in those bands, performance was about 48%, and statistically those weren't different when we ran the statistics on it. When we shifted that noise over then, so now it's only in the bands where the speech is not off frequency, performance jumped up to nearly 68%, getting close to 70%, and that was a statistical difference, where they were able to isolate the bands where the speech was to get a release from that masking that they were experiencing over here. So that's showing adult-like. But what about our 5-year-olds? So we know before on that other study, 5-year-olds were different. Remote maskers were affecting them. So what we saw with our 5-year-olds, performance in broadband was about 38%. Performance when it was on frequency, so the same spot, it was about 43%. Not statistically different. So that makes sense because it's mainly the frequencies that are overlapping that are causing most of that masking. When we shifted the noise to be off frequency, where before we expected for adults, it made a significant difference in performance. And for our 7-year-olds, it made a significant difference in performance. For our 5-year-olds, their performance only went up to like 55%, which was not a significant difference. So even though for others, shifting that noise to different peripheral filter bands where they could process the speech to get some masking release, our 5-year-olds didn't get that. So here's the summary of that. So adults and older children got that masking release when we shifted that noise to be spectrally interleaved. But the younger children did not. We saw some differences, but it's the statistics told us that's not actually really different. Because we can see stuff with our eyes sometimes that when we actually run the statistics, though, can be significant or not significant, and we need to trust those numbers more than our eyes for this one. So that's showing that they are not processing those filters as independently as we do as adults. For adults, we could ignore noise even when it was right next to the speech because it was a different peripheral auditory filter, and we can process those independently. And so this is leading us to think, well, maybe those 5-year-olds aren't doing that as much. Maybe there's more broader listening. So here's a summary. So what we know about adults. There's some frequency-specific listening. When there was a remote masker, they listened to just where the speech was, completely ignored those remote maskers because frequency-wise, they were nowhere near the speech. They could ignore it. When we even had noise right next to the speech, they were still able to do frequency-specific listening. They were able to disregard that noise and focus only to the places where the speech was to have pretty good performance. Those older children, the 7-year-olds, they were performing similar to adults. What is that? I do much better than my noise. They performed similar to adults. They were able to ignore those remote maskers. They were able to ignore and process just those bands where the speech were and ignore those other ones, even though they were right next to them. But even just between 7 years old and 5-year-olds, we saw a difference. So these 5-year-olds, when we added in that remote masker, their performance dropped. They couldn't do as well. They could not isolate that frequency region away from where they were attending to the speech. And then, of course, since, well, they couldn't even do it when the noise was remote, they struggled when that was interleaved between it also. So, okay, now what? What does this mean? Well, for my research, what this means now, I was looking at what can normal kids do. Normal. Good hearing, good language skills. All the sentences and the words that we used were vocabulary appropriate for 5-year-olds. So we tried to eliminate as much of the linguistic measure that we could that would be linguistically appropriate for them. But, you know, in our clouded classrooms where kids are listening to speech and noise, you have kids with hearing impairments. And you have kids with language impairments. And noise could be affecting them even greater than those normal, typical kids. There's also, for what we do in our educational environments, we need to take this noise into consideration. That even if it's a high-pitched fan that's not spectrally overlapping with the teacher's voice, it could be reducing how much of the speech signal they can process. And it has considerations for the hearing devices we use. Things like FM systems, hearing aids, and cochlear implants. Especially with hearing aids, we know that people with hearing aids have difficulty in noise at a different proportion that they do for just audibility in general. Noise is a struggle for them. With cochlear implants, they rely on different bands of speech. They input messages in different bands. And we're saying that, well, in normal hearing kids, they can't isolate their peripheral filter bands and attend to them specifically. Well, what's that mean then when we're sending cochlear implant messages through different electrodes in different frequency regions and any overlap? And as we try to improve them, take that into consideration. So I have room that I could talk about a whole lot more stuff and take questions and stuff.
I think it's my email.
Oh, it's your you're getting popular at the end of the day. So part of where I came from was clinical, and then moving into more research stuff. And I'm a big proponent of, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to do your work. And whether you are interested in research and want to be a researcher, it takes help from your collaborators to do your best work. And if you're a clinician, realizing that the people sitting next to you now are your colleagues, and they're your best resource, and working with each other. So these are the people who were my advisor, Eric Healy, other faculty, Rachel Holt and Allison Elawati, and Freda Pooks, and like other PhD students that I worked with. We all helped together to, think out our ideas, help talk each other through, like, that's just wrong, you need to fix that, and talk it out to each other, and give each other, constructive feedback. And that's Sarah Yoho Leopold, Brittany Carter, and Jordan Basco were essential for this for me. And getting kids into a research lab to listen to that for hours is amazing. And their parents for bringing them in to actually do that was great for me. And all of this work was done at Ohio State University before I went to St. Mary's. And it was funded partially through NIH and an alumni grant from the university. And if you want references, there's the references. Okay, any questions? Or you want me to launch into other stuff? Question? Go. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Can you describe for us briefly what actually happened during the test with a 5-year-old? What did you ask them to do? Like, how do you make sure they understand what the sentence really working?
Exactly. So for our 5-year-olds, especially, this is where my speech therapy skills came into play. It's definitely the arts and sciences of what you do as a speech-language pathologist and pediatric audiologist. The kids would be told, we're going to be doing some listening games. You're going to hear, like for the sentence, you're going to hear a sentence and you're going to tell me what you heard. As simple as that. And so kind of like a listening game. They got practice, they got familiar with the noise. Sometimes they came up with their own descriptions of what they thought the noise sounded like. A lot of times filtered speech was like, it's an astronaut. Because that's kind of, the radio communication systems are filtered speech. And so it sounds like that. So this is kind of what it sounds like. And then that background noise, that ksh, well, that's the space shuttle taking off. And so, we're listening to, and I let them go with their stories. So we're going to listen to some sentences, and it's going to be noisy. You just tell me what you heard. And we kept it very simple and straightforward like that. They actually were really good at that. They liked that it was challenging because they thought they were proving themselves. Like, I got this. That was, the cat ran out the window. And that's how we did it. And then since that actually does get boring after a while, there's lots of breaks. And lots of sticker chart rewards after we finished a block. And now we're going to go do some more. And now we're going to go do some more. For words, and you might have noticed, so in my examples, it was always like, ready, and you will say. I always gave a carrier phrase. Something to prep them because attention for little 5-year-olds. Oh, what's that? What's this? Okay, now's your time to listen. Okay, here it is. And making sure they had this get ready thing. I had another study that I didn't talk about that was just listening to tones. That was harder because then it's not like the telephone game to them where they just get to repeat back what they heard. For that game, it was that we had like a froggy and a bird and one of them's going to beep. You have to tell me which one. And something like that. For kids, the easiest thing was just that I had a scoring sheet, and then as they said, I'm marking which words they said, which words they didn't. We had all normal speech and language kids. I did have one that had a little R issue, but as a speech language pathologist, that was fine. I was really good at understanding kid speech, and even if they don't quite have all their phonemes. Oh, we got lots now. Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm a linguist, so I apologize if my questions sound dumb, because I don't have a lot of knowledge here. About your first experiment, I have 2 questions for you. How many tokens were used per condition? Talk about speech and voice, and then remote masters. And does the number of tokens affect performance at all?
Number didn't affect, because we looked at like how they're performed, like we did this split half reliability, where we look at like the first half of their answers and the second half, and that didn't really have an effect. Let me see if I have it on here, on my bonus materials, how many trials they had. Oh, yeah. I don't have it on here, but so for when they were listening to the sentences in that remote noise, they would listen to 20 sentences in that noise condition. And then they would listen to a different noise condition, 20 sentences. And we blocked it like that. And we would do it randomized so that different kids heard them in different orders. So that we kind of try to eliminate any effect of going from easiest to hardest or hardest to easiest. And then they would do a second round of that in a different randomized order. And that way they got enough exposure with that noise that they could get used to it and do well. But making it randomized across kids so that we didn't always have it, well, the hardest first and then the easiest, or the easiest so that we ease you into it. And we found when we even compared across, well, who got the easy ones first and the hard ones second, how did their performance compare? We didn't see a difference. And so that kind of made us more satisfied with than looking at our results.
Yeah, my point was exactly that, because you hear many times, you get used to something.
You get good at this, yeah.
So that's, I was wondering how you try
actually,
to avoid that.
We gave them practice because we wanted them to be the best they could at this. So we had them do practices for all of them because we wanted to get what is your best performance, because we want that you're trying your best, you're listening, you're focusing, and you know what's coming, and we definitely made sure we wanted the best performance they could give us because we made it hard. As you heard, it was difficult, so we wanted their best performance. And yeah, and we didn't see much difference depending on if they got an easier block first or not. Yes?
Yes. So this is a really interesting research project, and you gave a really good presentation, so thank you. So if I understand this correctly, what you're trying to do is to identify the source of differences between these three age groups in terms of their ability to process the auditory signal. So you manipulated the acoustic signal in different ways in order to identify what's responsible for the different performances. However, we also know that these three groups, they have different language abilities, maybe. I think you mentioned very well that you have tried to control for that by making sure your participants all understood what they had to do. So all the materials you use are well-formed sentences. So that means it takes us not just the ability to process the acoustic signal, but also to put things together. So the syntactic, grammatical abilities. And we went to this Acoustical Society meeting in Salt Lake City, and I think one of the things I learned was that as you age, your ability to use your cognitive abilities to understand, comprehend spoken language actually increases. So auditory enhancements actually help the elderly people more than a normal young adult, for example. So my point here is, do we have independent measures of their ability to process language in general? And the other side of this question would be, say, if you design an experiment in which you use a sentence that is basically nonsense, so they don't conform to any grammatical rules, whatever, do you also expect to see the same pattern here or not?
Right. Well, you're right. So we have two different ways of processing, kind of bottom up, where we go from like these basic acoustic signals and then process and put together, or top down, where cognitively, okay, linguistic cues, and I know that the cat was, okay, where would a cat be? And I'm priming myself for that pathway. So there are those to look at. One of my thoughts has been the SPIN sentences, speech and noise test, has low predictability and high predictability sentences. And that would be a next place to go. The sentences I used here are high predictability because they're normal sentences that make sense. So I could do like a nonsense sentences, like green ideas, sleep furiously, or low predictability, like she thought about the dog, where it could be the sentence itself is kind of like a carrier that it could probably be anything at the end. You know, she considered the whale. It could be lots of things. And so you take away any linguistic cues that they're getting it because it's a very low predictability. So that is a consideration because we looked at, with the words, we looked at neighborhood density of those. And that was, I like went in the linguistics direction that I didn't feel confident enough to bring today. And looking at what was the difference of the neighborhood density of those words, that they would be primed and ready for those because those are ones that they had lots of neighbors to categorize with. Okay, remind me, what was the other point that you said? No, there was another one.
Oh, there was another?
Yeah, there was. How we process in the linguistic context. But and so these kids, we looked at, we gave them a quick receptive language screening because we wanted to make sure they could understand directions, they get sentences, even complex sentences, that they were processing those normal. And so we controlled our kids that way. And it was the age groups. So we know that yes, these ages, they're different. They have different language abilities. For this, I tried to keep it, all right, who was our lowest language ability group? Those 5-year-olds. So let's have everything that would be appropriate for 5-year-olds. And so, yes, our adults were listening to what would be the PBK, Phonetically Balanced Kindergarten Word List. Because that's kind of our lowest common denominator for those 5-year-olds. They're going to lead how we take our stimuli. That's a whole direction in this, to look at this linguistic aspect. Because how much of this is relying on just that top-down, having enough auditory information to switch to a top-down processing, and having enough language ability to use that, because maybe that trumps the acoustic signal. Maybe that language processing trumps that acoustic processing. Or maybe vice versa. Oh, who knows? Yeah, we're getting into that part. That's where I need collaborators and colleagues who know more of the linguistic side of that. Yeah?
Yeah, let me ask about one basic question about clinical implications. So I think I'm in this area more than 20 years right now. And people talking about noise and noise. Noise is bad. Okay, so you want to improve the FM system, kind of the acoustics, and so let the raise your voice a little bit higher. And you may end up having the voice problem. So you may come to the speech pathologist, fix your voice. Yeah, see. So what I'm saying is, and then, so what? So what? So you have noise is bad, okay? And then this poor 5 years old is worse than 6 years old. I don't know what that 1 year, what happened at time of their life. So, and then we are doing those kind of study about the acoustic information, and let the kids suffer about 1 hour listening lab, give them little stickers and candy. So what? So where you want to go from here? So you want to put everybody FM system in the classroom? So what, do you want to make the new building to the acoustically control the classroom?
Well, think of as we're building new school buildings, incorporating the acoustics into what we're building now. So when we look at overall educational policies, anything new we're building, taking that noise into account. Classroom size is a big one. As school funding is shrinking, one of the answers is to have larger amounts of kids in a classroom. And one of the things, children with hearing impairments, all kids who are learning to read, which in the beginning is very, phonetically based, and we look on phoneme segmentation and phoneme blending, and it's a very auditory-driven process. Normal kids learning to read, when they get to 4th grade, there's kind of that 4th grade slump because it switches from the I'm learning to read to then reading to learn. Kids with hearing impairments hit that 4th grade slump and plateau, whether they have assistive devices or not. And if we can catch it early, that we see that these differences are happening between 5 and 7. Is there anything in the acoustic signal that we could help with to give them more access to that information? What is going on? Or is it a language content? Having exposure to enough speech and language content to carry that over. I feel like that's, the clinical implication gets into more, how are we shaping education as policies move forward? As we go in directions of classroom sizes and our expectations for what kids are expected to do in the classroom. Kindergarten now is a little different than how you may have been in kindergarten. The expectations with federal mandates and what's it called again? Common Core, yes. At kindergarten, we're doing what we used to be doing in 1st grade for literacy and phoneme awareness. And so, then we need to control that classroom size if we're expecting them to listen and process and hear these sounds. So I feel like that's where this kind of leads. Does that answer?
Another email.
You mentioned that you did a similar experiment except using tones. So did you guys look at, or is there much research out there that looks at actually measuring the bandwidth of peripheral auditory filters in young kids?
Yes, that is what it was. So it's called kind of spectral attention bands. So we have the peripheral auditory filters, and we know the tuning curves of that. If we look at how well adults hear a tone in a certain frequency region, and then especially if we prime them, if we say, here's what you're going to hear, beep, and then we play that beep, they're great, even if it's really quiet or masked by noise. If you prime them for that beep and then give them beep, they don't hear it because they were expecting this tone here. And so they spectrally attend to that certain frequency region because you've primed them for it. And we know that research on adults, but there was very limited information about what kids did. What I could find was one study from 1970 that looked at, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. And then gave a mean performance. So tuning curves are pretty sharp on normal hearing adults. And they saw like the mean performance for adults is pretty sharp. It follows that tuning curve. For kids, it was broader in this study. And then there is stuff about what infants do. And here's infants. So if adults are primed for a signal and you give them a frequency that's a little bit further away, their performance drops off because it wasn't where they were expecting it to, weren't where they were focused. When they did that with infants, they prime you for beep, and then they play beep. Infants were detecting those beeps 80% of the time, showing kind of a flat performance that they were not tuning in. They weren't zoning into that spectral region, and spectrally attending to where that peripheral filter was. That's what was out there. And so then I wanted to say, well, what about kids in between? That one study from 1970 didn't really even tell us the ages very well of who those kids were. So I looked at, well, and that was kind of the first step that led me to then, well, how do they spectrally attend for speech? How did they spectrally attend for when it was just detecting a tone, when we prime you that, okay, the beep, here's a beep, now tell me where the other beep was. Let's see what we got. Let's see. Oh, and here's the cute way that it was done. So this is how you work with kids. So they were given a priming beep, beep, and then in one of these intervals was going to be another beep. A lot of the time it was the same tone they were primed for, just quieter, because we wanted them to keep listening. Oh, that's priming me, it sounds the same. And then some of the times it was going to be higher or lower, and a certain frequency width away from where the priming tone was. So what we found, that's individualist, means are easier to look at. So adults are these little triangles here. So we primed them at 1,000 hertz. And so adults heard 1,000 hertz, we primed them for it about 90% of the time, they were hearing it than when we played it even quieter. When we got further away, 1,033 hertz, it's like a fourth of an erb away, which is kind of a peripheral filter distance. Performance dropped because it wasn't close to where they were expecting it to happen. They were so focused on listening and spectrally attending to this area, they would miss the beep when it was just a little bit higher, a little bit lower. When we looked at 6 to 8-year-olds, that's the open circle, it looks kind of flat. So even though we primed them for that 1,000 hertz tone, when we got a little higher, a little lower, they were still hearing it. So listening kind of across, not attending. And then when we looked at our 5-year-olds, it's a closed circle. The performance is a little lower, but also pretty flat across. So as adults, maybe that's why we do so well with speech and noise. We can really spectrally attend and isolate a frequency region. and we expect it to happen there, we tune into it even more, and it happens there. For infants, and kind of what we're seeing for these kids, they're not doing that listening strategy. And this is where it gets into, maybe it's a cognitive processing, maybe it's just a listening strategy. They're just listening across those frequency regions because they're not sure where the important information is going to be. It makes a lot of sense for infants as we're developing and learning in our speech and language development of, well, what are the important speech stuff? I don't know, I'm going to kind of listen everywhere until I figure out what's important, and then I'll focus in. And so then trying to pinpoint in, well, when are kids becoming more adult-like? So what's interesting here is when we looked at the speech stuff, the 7-year-olds were performing adult-like in a lot of those tasks that I had them do that made them isolate speech in frequency regions. But here we're seeing that even despite that they were doing it on the speech tasks, with the tone detection tasks, they weren't quite there yet. They weren't to an adult-like level on what strategy they're using. So it could be a completely different strategy or something else. So, yeah.
Well, we are out of time. So if you have any more questions, I'm sure Carla will stick around to answer your questions. But thank you so much for this.